Welcome to another episode of the 6Ps podcast. Today we are focusing on the 7 stages of grieving and we're going to look at scenes 1 to 9. Just to give you an overview of this video, part 1 will comprise of some pre-reading information and a brief summary of the first 9 scenes. Part 2 will be reading of those scenes. And part 3 will be a brief analysis. And I emphasize brief because there is so much to analyze in this text. It's a really rich and dense text, but I'll just pinpoint a couple of ideas which I think are important to recognize with the first 9 scenes. Let's start with the pre-reading information. And what's really important to note is there's only one actor in this text, and that is that of the woman. But there are so many characters throughout this text, and there is a reason behind it. The woman's experiences and her family and her identity are meant to be that of not just her as one Indigenous person, but widespread across First Nations people. Her experiences are meant to transcend the whole culture and community. The sets are quite minimal, but props and sound effects add detail. It is a non-linear structure, and you'll know when there's a passing of time because, again, there are sound effects. And the stage directions when you read through the text are in italics and they're in bold. And these are really important for us to understand the performance side of the play. And they also provide us with more detail, potentially to do with the characters as well, their thoughts and feelings. Something to mention too is the titles of each of the scenes. They sometimes too give away some details about what is going to happen on stage in that scene. Just to run you through a brief overview of those first 9 scenes for a brief summary, the prologue is essentially an acknowledgement and warning to First Nations audience members about what's about to happen on stage. Scene 2 is called Sobbing, where we're introduced to the protagonist, and there's an overview of emotions felt by First Nations people. There's no dialogue in this scene. In fact, that's sort of an acknowledgement to the non-Indigenous audience about what they can expect throughout the play. Purification involves a smoking ceremony in the native tongue, and the first time we get dialogue is in scene 4, which is Nana's story. And this details a story about the woman's grandmother who recently passed away. She is the matriarch of the family and known for her storytelling, and her death leaves them in mourning and a sense of grieving as well, because her storytelling is really important. Photograph story involves the woman opening up a suitcase and describing photographs of her family members and the associated memories that she has with that. And this again is very visual because some of these photographs appear on the screen for the audience. Scene 6, Story of a Father, is about the woman coming to terms with her father's impending death. He's about to die and she sits at his grave thinking about his life. Front and centre is when the woman tells the story of an old auntie who attends funerals in the hopes of finding a relative. She's a member of the Stolen Generations. Family Gallery is similar to scene 5, except there's no real dialogue at all. It's just more photos from the woman's family that are displayed for the audience. And the last scene we're going to look at today, scene 9, is called Black Skin Girl, where the woman, our main character, sings a song as a child, really, and letters are shone upon her. Her initial childlike demeanour subsides for a feeling of anguish. And that is a summary of the first 9 scenes. So let's go to the readings. Actually, let's not do that. Let's focus on the key themes that the first 9 scenes really focus on. And again, these are just 4 that I think are really important: grief, memory, family, and loss and death. So when you're reading these scenes, these are possibly some of the themes you might want to look at and think about the longest memory as you do so, and what connections you can make in terms of the similarities and the differences. Scene 1, Prologue. A large block of ice is suspended by 7 strong ropes. It is melting, dripping onto a freshly turned grave of red earth. The performance area is covered in a thin layer of black powder, framed by a scrape of white. Within this space, there are projection surfaces. Ladies and gentlemen, We would like to take this opportunity to warn members of the audience that the following performance contains names and visual representations of people recently dead, which may be distressing to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. All care has been taken to acquire the appropriate permission and to show all proper respects. Thank you. Scene 2. Sobbing. The faint sound of someone crying in the dark. The sobbing grows into a wail as the lights reveal an Aboriginal woman alone with her grief. As her weeping subsides, words are projected up on the screen. Grief, grieving, sorrow, loss, death, pain, distress, lament, mourn, emptiness, despair, lonely, regret, misfortune, guilt, passion, love, absence, desolate, nothing, nothing, I feel nothing. Scene 3. Purification. The woman lights up a wad of eucalypt leaves and watches them burn. She blows out the flame, and as the embers smoke, she sings a song for the spirits of those that have gone before her, and asks permission to tell the story of her grief. Muraba Buladu. Ugilla, Ugilla, Munan G. Ugilla, Ugilla, Munan G. Buladu, Buladu, Muraba, Buladu. Buladu, Buladu, Muraba, Buladu. Buladu, Buladu, Muraba, Buladu. Ugilla, Ugilla, Munanji. Ugilla, Ugilla, Munanji. Scene 4. Nana's story. The performing area is flooded with colour. Floral patterns cover the woman's dress. The story is textured with sounds of family, country music, and the call of the kingfisher. The only thing black at a funeral should be the colour of your skin. And so all my young cousins wore bright floral dresses. My grandmother was a strong, God-fearing woman who at the age of 62 was taken from us, moved on, passed away. My family were in mourning for a month, all of us together in 5 houses. We numbered close to 50 people. My grandmother didn't want to go to the hospital because that's where people went to die. Most of her friends had never come back. She was a woman who couldn't trust doctors, a woman who couldn't speak to teachers or police, wouldn't answer the telephone, gave her tithe to the church, and got nervous at the mention of the government. The whole family came together for meals. Huge barbecues, bowls of salads laid out on makeshift trestles, tropical fruits, bread, pasta, rice. No matter what you were having for dinner, there was always rice. Stew, rice. Steak and chips, rice. Sandwiches, rice. Hot rice, cold rice, in between rice. Ah, don't. So much steak and sausages and mince, chicken, stuff we had spent half the day cooking, or pots of things other family had brought over. Nana would tell us of the days when there wasn't enough to feed all the kids. She wouldn't tell us a lot of stories, but when she did, we all listened. She'd sing to us. The sound of country music mixing with the clicker-clack of knives and forks, and then someone would start singing along. Before you knew it, the older generation were in the middle of Delta Dawn, and us lot all cringed. Even to this day, I can still sing all the words, but I won't. There was so much going on. Sometimes you didn't notice two people hugging, sobbing in the hallway. Everyone had their time. Sometimes you felt like crying, and sometimes the joy of being there was enough to forget, even for the briefest moment, the reason. My sister reckons that she knew about Nana first. In the middle of the night, the sound of a bird singing had woken her up. She went to the kitchen. She made a pot of tea. She sat beside the phone and waited. When it finally rang, she answered, "I know." 400 people. 400 people turned up to the service. They couldn't fit in the church. They just sat in the shade listening from outside, but when we got to the grave, a song caught on around the gathering, the old aunties, the uncles, until they were all singing. The words were unfamiliar to me, and the tune soared above us with the kingfisher. The woman reflects on this moment. Back at the house, the boys painted up and danced, and the girls showed a thing or two as well. The neighbours watched from the safety of their kitchen windows. One fella came out to water his garden. Gammon-like, another had his video camera, and we talked and drank and laughed. The kids got a video, but when it came to sleeping, shit. Cushions, mattresses, lounges and back seats in cars, black fellas as far as the eye could see. I miss my grandmother. She took so many stories with her to the grave. Stories of her life, our traditions, our heritage, who I am. Gone. The woman sings, recalling the first few lines of Delta Dawn. Scene 5. Photograph story. A chair scrapes across a wooden floor. Footsteps recede. A clock ticks. Projected are images of an open suitcase filled with family photographs, old and new. The progression of slides brings us closer into the details of the photographs. In the house of my parents where I grew up, there's a suitcase which lives under the old stereo in the front room. The room is full of photographs, trophies, pennants, memories of weddings, birthdays, christenings and family visits. A testimony to good times, a constant reminder. But this suitcase, which resides under the old stereo tightly fastened, which lies flat on the floor comfortably out of reach, safe from inquisitive hands or an accidental glance. In this suitcase lies the photos of those who are dead. The nameless ones, and here they lie, passing the time till they can be talked of again. Without a word, we remove the photo of my Nana from her commanding position on the wall and quietly slip her beneath the walnut finish, and without a sound push her into the shadow. Everything has its time. Everything has its time. Scene 6. Story of a father. The woman sits on the edge of the grave. I'm trying to deal with Dad's death. He hasn't died yet, but the time is coming soon when he'll be taken away. He's 48, in and out of hospital. He knows he needs to rest, but he hasn't stopped fighting since 1967. I know it seems selfish that the thought is on myself rather than Dad. I know, but the time is coming when this won't be a rehearsal anymore. Sometimes I'll find myself crying in the dark alone. The pain comes in, and I cry and cry until I can't feel anymore. Numbed. Nothing. But I've got my home, and I've got my family, and I'll never have to live through what my dad lived through. It's inevitable, death. The one thing that I find comforting about it is that everyone's got to do it. Philip Ruddock, Bruce Ruxton, John Laws, Alan Jones, Stan Zemanek, Pauline Hanson, David Oldfield, Cheryl Curnow, just for being stupid. Scene 7, front and centre. I went to a funeral the other week. A young fella had died. No family really, by himself. But in the front row, front and centre, I noticed this old auntie crying that heavy wailing cry. Now, I knew she couldn't have known this fella. He had no family to speak of, and at the end of the service, she just slipped out without talking to anyone. It was playing on my mind. I decided to follow her, see where she went. She didn't live far from the church, just around the corner in a flat under someone's house. It didn't faze her when I knocked. She welcomed me straight in. The first thing I noticed were the 5 cats she had, and then the newspapers. Piles and piles. And on the dining table. At first I thought the table was full of form guides for the horses, pages with bright blue circles, but when I got closer, I could see they were the pages of death notices. And the things she circled were today's funerals. I could see she spends her day going from church to church, going to funerals. She didn't bat an eyelid when I asked her why. I might be related, she answered. I never knew my family. Maybe I could meet my real family, and if not, I get to have a good cry anyway. The woman leaves. Scene 8, family gallery. A collection of family photos are projected like portraits in a gallery. They are recognisable as images from the suitcase. Scene 9, black skin girl. The woman dances around, childlike, singing. Letters of the alphabet appear on her dress. At first, it is a game, but one from which she tires. She attempts to evade the letters by removing her dress. She is left topless, with the letter Z on her chest. Alright, it's now time to look at our analysis. And as I said, it's going to be pretty brief because every scene is quite dense. But I've got a few dot points for each scene that I'll touch upon. But definitely, in your own time, go through this thoroughly and look at everything within each scene. They're all purposeful, they're all worthy of their own analysis. I wanted to start with the prologue and particularly the use of props. I think they're really crucial and they've been added deliberately. They've got a whole heap of meaning. And even if you look at the stage directions that describe these in the prologue, they're quite descriptive. You've got a large block of ice, 7 strong ropes, grave of red earth, thin layer of black powder, and a scrape of white. So the block of ice, which is in every scene, again, it's meant to represent the frozen tears almost of First Nations people, given the grief, the suffering, the trauma that they've experienced. I think the fact that it's a large block of ice suggests how significant the emotional toll has been for First Nations people. If you think about the 7 strong ropes, again, they're meant to sort of symbolise the 7 stages of Aboriginal history. But the fact that they're so strong too, and the fact that they are ropes, can be connected to the genocide which occurred. The grave of red earth, well, the colour red, of course, and the thin layer of black powder and the scrape of white, which appear on the performance area, is really important because it goes to show the way in which the Indigenous culture has been treated, how a lot of history has been told through the Western lens, but that this is a stage where this history can be told from a First Nations perspective. But again, just to touch upon that block of ice, it slowly drips throughout the whole play until eventually it is unfrozen. Scene 2, again, there's no dialogue in this particular scene, but the stage directions are really important. It opens with the faint sound of someone crying in the dark, and the sobbing grows into a wail. The fact that the sound is off stage is really important. It's isolated or hidden, much like the pain and suffering of Indigenous people has been hidden for a really long time. The words themselves are all really negative emotions that have been felt throughout history, apart from 2, passion and love, which have been included to juxtapose those. The last sentence, I feel nothing, comes up later on in the text as well. But the audience here are encouraged to consider and contemplate each term separately, particularly a non-Indigenous audience. I think the prologue is designed for a First Nations audience, but the second one not so much. Scene 3, purification. There's a song that is both spoken and sung in Kamilaroi words, which obviously is really important. We know the importance of language, and the fact it's a smoking ceremony as well is really important. It's that close connection to land. You can look at, I guess, the smoke, the fire, the leaves themselves. The leaves are, eucalypt leaves are a symbol of healing. Smoke, haze and fog usually suggest uncertainty. But fire is one of potentially purging or cleansing or purification. It's up to you how you want to sort of analyse that. But the idea here is that the stage does become Aboriginal land through the smoking ceremony. If you are unsure of any of the Kamilaroi words that are used throughout this text, I will sort of direct you to the glossary at the very end of the play. It's very important. We'll move to scenes 4 to 6. Each of these scenes contains the word story in the scene title, which is significant and again emphasises that importance of storytelling. The first one is Nana's story, and Nana's death causes the woman to reflect on her family and her culture, her big family, one that numbered close to 50 people. We might touch upon kinship systems a little bit later on in the text, but definitely very, very important. The importance of family is definitely explored, particularly the matriarchal nature of First Nations people, which is very different to the patriarchal nature of the Western world, that culture clash there. And in fact, the culture clash comes up a little bit later on when, firstly with the singing of Delta Dawn, but also when the neighbour or the neighbours look at what's going on. Once again, the importance of storytelling is showcased here, particularly the fact, and it comes up at the bottom of page 27, that Nana would tell us of the days when there wasn't enough to feed all the kids, that she wouldn't tell us a lot of stories, but when she did, we all listened. She'd sing to us. And that tradition of elders passing down those stories, those memories to the younger generations, especially obviously through language, through oral traditions, and the significance of upholding that, and how Nana's death actually thwarts that. The last thing I wanted to mention, and it's more prevalent in later on scenes, particularly with Daniel, but institutions like the police, like the law, like governments, and the way they've imposed their own traditions and stereotypes and prejudices onto First Nations people. And we see that the grandmother was particularly wary of places like hospitals, teachers, police, even doctors as well. And I think that's worth exploration a little bit later on. Scene 5, photograph story, is where the woman provides the audience with an insight into her family through photographs that are kept in a suitcase. You could definitely analyse the suitcase in a lot of different ways. I think the fact that it's hidden in this scene is really important, the way that memories are sort of hidden away, not really spoken about. The idea about trauma, you can definitely link that to the longest memory. You could suggest that the suitcase represents, displaced identity, or the idea that suitcases are used for travelling and then put away. We'll probably touch upon that at a later video. Something to note to start this particular scene, which is quite a visual scene because photographs are used and shown to the audience, which provides authenticity and realism, is the fact that a chair scrapes across a wooden floor, that footsteps recede and a clock ticks. That's meant to indicate the passing of time. This comes up a little bit later on in the text as well, I should say. So you do get that. Scene 10 from memory is where it appears again to show the passing of time, and again, the idea that this is a non-linear structure, this play. Scene 6, story of a father, is where the woman reflects on her father's upcoming death. He's 48, which is quite young, but I guess highlights the discrepancy in the expected life, or the average life expectancy of a First Nations person as opposed to one who isn't. There's also a reference here to 1967 was a referendum, and perhaps the fact that the father has been fighting for equality since then, that I guess he's been a bit of an activist, but this has had a toll on his life. You can analyse the fact that this is a story of a father as well. This isn't just her father. This could be a number of other people's stories that she's sharing here. There's also references to some racist journalists and politicians. These were particularly prominent in the 90s. So journalists like John Laws, Alan Jones, Stan Zemanek, and then we even see someone like Pauline Hanson, who's referenced here, still in the Senate today. That in itself is quite interesting. There's some black humour at the end there as well when she calls them stupid. But when we talk about this cyclical nature of discrimination and prejudice, the fact that Pauline Hanson was in, Parliament then in 1995, in the lower house, and then, obviously an absence of a number of years, and now she's in the upper house, is significant about the cyclical nature of these laws and institutions. All right, scene 7 is front and centre. A bit of an ironic title, I guess you could say, given it's about a member of the stolen generation who were predominantly hidden or been erased from history, really. This is the woman recalling attending a funeral where she sees an old auntie. Another character who doesn't have a name. In fact, most characters in this text don't have a name, apart from, I guess, Auntie Grace, who's given a name, but she's, I guess, been westernised to an extent when she moves to London and she loses her Indigenous identity along the way. But something, again, to consider. Old Aunt Auntie has no family and sadly must resort to obituaries and funeral notices in the paper in the hope of finding relatives, in the hope of gaining some sort of identity and sense of belonging, which, again, is just awful. Old Auntie doesn't have a name, and again, her story forms part of a greater and horrific shared experience by members of the stolen generation, whose whole sense of identity, culture and family were eradicated by government policy. Again, that scene ends with the old auntie saying that even if she doesn't find anyone, at least she can have a good cry. Again, crying you hear, or weeping or wailing, to really emphasise the grief felt by these characters. Scene 8 is Family Gallery. Now, it looks really basic on paper. It's just 2 lines of stage directions. Photos from scene 5 reappear, but it's important in terms of where it's placed. It's placed directly after the scene with the older auntie who has no family, and therefore exacerbates her lack of family culture, memory, and her past. It's a really poignant inclusion and deliberate and worthy of analysis for sure. And the last scene we're going to have a look at today is Black Skin Girl. Quite a traumatizing scene where the woman dances around a child like singing to represent her innocence. Letters from the alphabet appear on her dress. This is obviously the English alphabet. Again, deliberate use here, given that the impact of colonisation, the eradication of Aboriginal languages, and the way that the British rule and law was enforced upon First Nations people. She obviously ties, it's a game, again, symbol of innocence, but then she ties, and that sort of emphasises her suffering. And then in order to evade the letters, she removes her dress and she's left topless, which represents her vulnerability, and the fact that the letter Z is on her chest shows that she cannot simply escape this. And obviously she's singing a song in Kamilaroi language as she's doing this, again to highlight that that loss of language, of culture. As I mentioned, that's a really brief look at those first 9 scenes, but a couple of things to take out from this, particularly if you're looking at the 7 stages of grieving and comparing it with longest memory, is the importance of storytelling and their connection to memory and past trauma, especially between generations, and how that's passed on. The fact that inherent and prevalent racism is within both societies, and the perspective of the characters in both texts allows for a more personalised version of these historical events. We don't get the Western angle of these stories. But please note the contrasting methods. The personalised vignettes in the longest memory are very different to the 7 stages of grieving, which suggests that these experiences are widely endured by First Nations people.